Okay, I think we'll kick off. It's just 5 o'clock, so you can listen to me rattle on for a minute while everyone else comes in. But I'm actually delighted to have Richard Ovenden with us today. We did his book for, some of you will remember, we did his book, Burning the Books, for our book club. So it was very well liked. So he was requested to come speak. But Richard is a librarian author from Britain, and he currently serves as the Bodleian Librarian, having been appointed in 2014. And he also serves as the director of the Bodleian Library Centre for the Study of the Book and holds a professional fellowship at Balliol College. So I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions for him at the end of this fabulous talk. So we will go through those. Just pop them in the Q&A box below. And as I said just moments ago, if you do have any difficulties, just pop them into the chat box or email me, or you all have my phone number as well. So give me a buzz and I'll try and sort you out, and I will hand you over to Richard now.
Thank you very much indeed for the introduction, and thank you very much indeed for having me to come to Dublin to talk to you. The Chester Beat is definitely one of my favourite libraries. I was last there, I think, in sort of the summer of 2019. And I miss Dublin very much indeed, and I wish I could be giving this talk to you in person in your wonderful institution, but sadly you're going to have to make do with me online from my study in my home in Oxford. And I do have a PowerPoint which is going to sort of drive my talk this afternoon. It's going to last around 40 minutes, and I hope that if you have any questions, you'll be able to ask them later on. So without further ado, let me bring my PowerPoint up and hope that you can all see this, and we'll get it into slideshow mode. And fortunately, this talk is one where you need no introduction to the fact that I have written this book. Burning the Books, A History of Knowledge Under Attack is the UK title. It has a slightly different subtitle for the US edition, but it's exactly the same book. And the book is really, as you know, one about essentially the importance of the preservation of knowledge and of the role of libraries and archives as institutions, and librarians and archivists inside them in that task, which is one which I think is of great importance for society, and one which I've been concerned over recent years that society as a whole does not value or recognize the role that libraries and archives play, the job that we do for society as a whole, enough. And my book was in some ways an attempt to try and raise the topic in public discourse. And the fact that you've invited me here, I hope speaks to some of that and gives me an opportunity to share my thoughts more broadly with you. But there were other triggers, and one of those triggers for writing the book was actually going to Berlin in the spring of 2018, when I was just beginning to think about writing the book, and visiting the site where this event took place, the famous organized mass burning of books, which took place on the 10th of May, 1933, an event orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels for the Nazi Party, and where books from local libraries and bookshops were piled high in this place, a very kind of culturally resonant place in the center of Berlin, and set on fire in front of cameras and in front of a mass ranks of students. And as I was walking around this site, which is now commemorated by a very kind of moving plaque, it struck me that actually this wasn't all that long ago. 1933, my mum, who's still with us, was alive in 1933. She was only 4 years old, but you know, it is not that long ago. We mustn't forget those events. And also, at the same time that I was thinking about this book, the idea of contested facts, alternate facts, this phrase coined by Kellyanne Conway in defiance of the evidence that Barack Obama had more people attend his inauguration than President Trump did, was something that really has been kind of eating away at me. What role do libraries and archives have in defending society against the idea that there can be such things as alternate facts? But the real trigger was actually the my anger at the British government's handling of immigration policy and the so-called hostile environment, and the pressure that the UK government's Home Office had placed on fellow citizens, many of whom had been resident in the UK for decades, forcing them to produce documentation to prove their right to remain settled, their right to settled status in the UK. And at the same time, an investigative journalist for the Guardian newspaper had discovered that the same government department had destroyed an archive of documentation which those same citizens could have used to defend themselves against deportation within the hostile environment. And I wrote an op-ed piece for the Financial Times newspaper in April 2018. And following that, decided to turn that into a book. And that's the book that you've been reading. Thank you very much for doing that. So I've just sort of recap the main kind of themes of the book. The book covers a long sweep of history, and it looks back to the first libraries and archives that we know of, those formed by the first settled communities in Mesopotamia, and in particular looking at the Library of Ashurbanipal, the first library that scholars argue was attempting to encompass the whole of recorded knowledge as it was understood at the time. The Library of King Ashurbanipal of Assyria, based in his royal palace of Nineveh, and which was unearthed through archaeological investigation in the middle of the 19th century, finding an extraordinary range of cuneiform tablets. And these are what you're looking at. The library, a library of clay tablets, which were hidden by the destruction of the royal palace of Nineveh in the 7th century before the Christian era, and exhumed by Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam and other archaeologists in the middle of the 19th century, and now for the most part actually in the British Museum in London. And scholars working on them since then have discovered quite a lot about the formation of the library. And one particularly important detail is that the library was formed by attacking other libraries. And there are correspondence survives amazingly from this period, and accession registers, accession records for the library, which show that Ashurbanipal was targeting collections in enemy states, in the libraries and archives of Babylonia, which Assyria was at war with and victorious over. And he targeted his agents from seizing those books, extraordinary looking books, as you'll agree from this image, but books nonetheless, and bringing them back to his own library. And this idea that these texts, and many of the texts, were about the prediction of the future. So astronomy, astrology, divination, and that by depriving your enemies of these texts would make them weaker. It would weaken their ability to predict the future, but it would make you stronger. because knowledge, this idea that knowledge is power and accumulating and controlling knowledge is an ancient concept and one that's very much with us today. And I'd like you to hold this thought about the control of knowledge and the control of the ability to predict the future, because we'll come back to it at the end of my talk. And I also talk in the book about perhaps the most famous or infamous or episode of the destruction of knowledge, the attack on, or the so-called attack on the Great Library of Alexandria and its destruction, which I show from the work of contemporary scholars to be really a myth, that there was no single event when the Great Library of Alexandria, and here's a text with an association with the library, the famous foundational text in mathematics, Euclid's Elements of Geometry, which Euclid wrote whilst studying in the Great Library of Alexandria. And we have the oldest surviving manuscript witness to the text from the 9th century in its Greek version. But the Great Library of Alexandria was not destroyed, as this Victorian wood engraving suggests, on a single event in the classical period, but rather there were a series of fires which did not fatally weaken the library, but actually all that the ancient writers agree on is that there was a great library, the greatest known in the ancient world, founded in the 4th century before the Christian era, and a great institution at least by the 1st century of the Christian era, but by the 4th century it was gone. And so that there were centuries of neglect and decline as the library ceased to be a priority for funding, for royal patronage, and for support at the highest level. And I think that's the biggest lesson for me for our own times, that we take these institutions, libraries and archives, for granted, and as they are being defunded across the world, we stand to lose so much from that process. I'd like to fast forward in time to the Reformation of the 16th century, particularly in England, and to two incidents. One is looking at the University of Oxford, my own institution, and here the library that I'm responsible for today actually has its origins in the Middle Ages, in the 14th century, when the first university library was formed in the church of St. Mary on the High Street. It's still a great building and a great institution today. And here, attached to it, which was begun in 1320, is the library room. And the fact that that building was constructed was thanks to a gift of cash and of books by Thomas Cobham, the Bishop of Worcester, who also established the first library position at that time as well. And here is one of the books given to the university in the middle of the 15th century by a man called Gilbert Keimer, the Dean of Salisbury. And the library grew so much, particularly thanks to a gift by Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the brother of Henry V in the 15th century, that it had to be moved out of the church to a new purpose-built library room, one that's still in use today as a library room, the kind of beating heart of the library system in Oxford today, known as Duke Humphrey's Library, but a place where those books were put in the 1430s and 1440s as they arrived from Duke Humphrey. And the building was completed by the 1480s and opened as a reading room at that time. So Oxford University, like many other libraries, hundreds of other great libraries, large, important, significant libraries in England and Wales by the middle of the 15th century, 16th century, were under attack. And they were under attack because of the Protestant Reformation. And I'm drawing your attention to one of the greatest libraries of the Middle Ages and one of the greatest religious houses of the Middle Ages, the Abbey of Glastonbury in Somerset, in the west of England. A very great and famous and wealthy institution, which to give you an idea of its prestige, the monastic building itself, the church building, was actually bigger than Canterbury Cathedral. And I'm taking this photograph on the site of where the medieval library would have been, just off the cloisters, and it was destroyed in 1539. And many of the books in that library, their pages were torn out, and like they were in Oxford and indeed in many other libraries, and sold as scrap. And there was a great saying in Oxford at the time that books were dog cheap and whole libraries could be had for an inconsiderable nothing. And here you can see fragments of those medieval books that were sold as scrap to bookbinders of the new technology, printed books. And here's an Oxford example of that, a printed book bound in Oxford in the middle of the 16th century with waste from a medieval book used to strengthen the bookbinding. Amazingly, at Glastonbury, we have a snapshot picture of what the monastic library there looked like, thanks to a man called John Leland, who was tasked by Henry VIII to support Henry's claim to be able to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and marry the beautiful courtier Anne Boleyn, and then later his claim to divorce the church in England from papal authority. And Leland was tasked to going and looking for important knowledge to back up the king's argument in the libraries of the great religious institutions. So he came to Glastonbury in 1533, and we can see the books that he looked at. It's extraordinary. These records, Leland's archive is fortunately in the Bodleian. I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom of this list. You can see it says Grammatica Uticis Liber Olim Sancti Dunstani. And actually that book that John Leland examined as he came into the famous library of Glastonbury, one which he tells us he was greatly looking forward to seeing, and that when he stepped across the threshold of the library, he swooned at the mere sight of the books. He was so excited and impressed by the books on the shelves that he was staggered, literally staggered. And one of those books is this, a very famous book, one of our great treasures, known as St. Dunstan's class book, actually a miscellany of texts from the 9th and 10th centuries, and one which was owned by Abbot Dunstan himself, the Abbot of Glastonbury Abbey, who later went on to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. And somebody who was later sanctified. So this is in a sense a holy book, and it's also one which has the oldest self-portrait in Western art, and you can see St. Dunstan kneeling at the foot of Christ on the this manufactured title page. And so, but those destructions of books, so the Great Library of Glastonbury Abbey had perhaps 1,500 or 2,000 books at the Reformation, but the class book of St. Dunstan, that book I've just shown you, is one of only 60 books that we know to have survived from that great institution. The same is true of the Library at Oxford University. Only a handful of books, only 11 of them survive from the 500 or so that were in the university's collection at the Reformation. We have to thank those few survivals to a few individuals who recognize the importance of preservation. And one of those is this man, Sir Thomas Bodley, painted by the great miniaturist Nicholas Hilliard, who was a childhood friend of his from Exeter in Devon. And Sir Thomas Bodley, a great courtier, somebody who'd done a very clever thing, which was to marry a rich widow, a man of great wealth, but somebody, even though he was a Protestant, somebody who regretted the destruction of books during the Reformation, and somebody who felt that preservation was something that needed to happen for knowledge. And the institution he refounded, the University Library, would be dedicated to the preservation of knowledge. And you can see that not just in the founding statutes of the library, in the instructions that he gave my predecessor, Thomas James, the first librarian, but also in the infrastructure that he built, lead-lined cupboards to house the manuscripts, and great instructions, most famously that nobody should kindle fire nor flame when entering the library. But that dedication to preservation actually was also something that's been in the library's DNA over the last 400 years. And there's one significant episode which is associated with John Milton and the other leaders of the Puritan movement in the middle of the 17th century, and many of whom, like Milton, were classed as regicides, the people who had argued for the execution of Charles I, and who, by the time the monarchy was re-established in the 16th centuries, were very much out of favor. And their books, more importantly, were out of favor. So when in the 1670s, the books of John Milton and others were ordered to be burned across the United Kingdom, my predecessor, Thomas Hyde, the fifth librarian, chose to hide a special volume of Milton's own printed works, which the author, the great poet himself, had presented to the library, partly because he was friendly with John Rouse, the second librarian. And in fact, Milton penned manuscript verses in praise of Rouse and in praise of the Bodleian in this volume. So by the 1670s, when the book should have been taken out and burned, Thomas Hyde risked his own reputation and perhaps his own safety by hiding it from the authorities. And so, you know, that urge, that impetus for preservation also goes back a long way. I'd like to fast forward in time again, this time to 1814, actually to the month of August, which, as we'll see, is not a great month for the survival of libraries, and to events that took place led by this man, Admiral Sir George Cockburn, the leader of a British expeditionary force that attacked its former colonies, the new United States, in the War of 1812, which continued through to 1814. And you can see in this splendid mezzotint in the background is an event that I'd like to draw your attention to: the burning of Washington, D.C., and in particular, the destruction of the Library of Congress. And you can see here a famous image of the library painted, a watercolor painted after the events of August 1814, when the British forces besieged Washington. They entered the city and they went straight for the most important building of government, the Capitol building, the place where the legislative houses sat, the chamber of the Senate and of the House of Representatives was found. There was an office occupied by the president and a library. And the Library of Congress was used not just by the members of the legislature themselves, the senators and the representatives, but by the officers of government, the administrators, the bureaucrats, who needed the library in order to manage the government of the nation. And it's that which British troops set fire to and burned the whole building, including the library, down in August 1814. But again, this act of destruction triggered an act of preservation and of renewal. And that act came by Thomas Jefferson, of course, one of the founding fathers of America, an early president, one of the architects of the Constitution of the United States, but a great bibliophile himself, somebody who had formed one of the most important, easily the most important private libraries in the United States, one of the most important libraries, full stop. And he had retired effectively to his country estate at Monticello in Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C., and he heard about the siege and the destruction of the library a few weeks after the events of August 1814, and wrote to a Washington newspaper offering his own collection to be purchased at favorable rates by the government to replace the lost library. And the loss of the library and the act of the British he called an act of barbarism, and he invoked the destruction of the Library at Alexandria in that letter. Actually, Congress argued over whether or not to allocate funds to buy the library for many months, but eventually they decided to do so. They chose about 7,000 books, again at knockdown prices from Jefferson's library, which was indeed purchased to replace the lost library. And if you go to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. today, you'll see a very wonderful exhibit trying to reconstruct the original library that was bought to replace the lost one. Sadly, Jefferson's books were all destroyed in an accidental fire in 1815, or most of them were destroyed. And so this is an attempt to reconstruct those lost books. I'd like to move us to much more recent events, and this time to the Holocaust of the Second World War and to events that took place in Lithuania and to its capital city, Vilna. And Vilna was a great center of Judaism. There were many Jews who lived in Vilna before World War II. Many hundreds of thousands lived in the city and in the country, but it was also a place of great libraries and archives. And one of them was this library, the Strashun, created by a wealthy Jewish businessman who, in the late 19th century, bequeathed it to the Jewish community in Vilna. And there was another institution called YIVO, which was founded in the 1920s as an archival and educational institution dedicated to preserving the documentation of the life of everyday Jews, the Jews who spoke the Yiddish language. So it was a center for Yiddish research called YIVO, and founded by an extraordinary man called Max Windrush. Here's the Strashun Library and its interior and its librarian, Chaiko Lunsky, who's the librarian on the eve of World War II. And here are some of the things that were collected by the YIVO Institute, this archival process to document, capture and preserve the life of everyday Jewish life in the Yiddish language. And so things like music hall, songs, you have medical records, you have even more famous documents like the diary of Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism. But sadly, of course, in 1941, Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, and the Blitzkrieg moved very rapidly into Central and Eastern Europe, and they were followed very, very closely. Behind the troops came another army, a cultural army, an army established by the person on the left called Alfred Rosenberg, one of the chief architects of anti-Semitism, who founded an institute in Frankfurt for the study of the Jewish question. And that institute had a library, and it had a librarian who you see in the image on your right called Johannes Pohl. And Pohl formed an operational group called the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. And they came after the shock troops to look for books and documents to be taken back to the library in the Frankfurt Institute. And that's what Johannes Pohl controlled. So in 1942, as the Blitzkrieg was unleashed, a ghetto was established in Vilna by the Nazis, and the Jews were all moved into the ghetto. That's the image on your left. And the ghetto would be destroyed. Ultimately, it will be liquidated in 1943 and 1944. And here's a photograph of it in 1946. And to give you a sense of what happened to Jewish books and documents from the libraries and archives of Central and Eastern Europe, like those in Vilna, you can see this Hebrew, religious document, religious text in Hebrew, and on the other side of it, this was reused as a canvas for an oil painting, in this case, of one of the leading Austrian Nazis, Arthur Seyss-Inquart. But what happened in Vilna was that librarians and archivists in the ghetto, Jewish librarians and archivists, were identified, and they were taken out by Johannes Pull and the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg to sort through the libraries and archives of the city for unique materials to be sent back to Frankfurt and for others to be sent for destruction in paper mills outside the city. And you can see that process going on in the images that you see on the screen. And this, of course, was a terrible thing for those librarians, archivists, scholars, and poets who were forced out of the ghetto every day at gunpoint to undertake this sorting. And they were called by the Nazi guards the Paper Brigade, and that label soon attached itself to this group of individuals. But what they decided to do was to try to preserve as many documents and books as they could. And so they hid them in their clothing and they smuggled them back into the ghetto every day. Every time they did that, they risked their own lives. An extraordinary act, perhaps one of the most inspiring case studies in my book, at least it is to me. And this act of preservation during the Holocaust by Jews took place not just in Vilna, but in other centers of Judaism, other centers of Jewish life across Central and Eastern Europe. And one of them was established by this man, Emanuel Ringelblum, who in the Warsaw Ghetto established a group called Hoyneg Shabbes, and they created an archive of life, of documentation, of photographs, of sweet wrappers, of all sorts of ephemeral pieces of paper, as well as children's drawings and other documents, which they accumulated and they hid, they buried, and in the hope, because they knew that they would not survive, in the hope that others would come after the war and recover the documents, which is indeed what happened. So in the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto, these documents were found in the rubble, and they were hid in metal containers and milk canisters, and the Ringelblum archive was for the most part preserved. Not all of the documents survived, but many of them did. And so too in Yivo, documents were hidden in the Warsaw Ghetto, in the Vilna Ghetto, in the hope that they would be recovered. And here actually you see a member of the American forces, a rabbi, in Frankfurt. This is the Frankfurt Institute's library, full of incredible collections, which were taken control of by American troops in 1945 as they moved into Germany. And those documents were sent back. There was a process that took many years, actually, to identify the rightful heirs of the communities from which the books in Frankfurt were stolen from. And there was an attempt to reunite those books with those communities. And so some of the documents which had identification marks from the Yivo archive and from the Strashun library in Vilna were sent to the branch of YIVO that survived in New York. And here you can see the staff of YIVO in New York unpacking boxes sent from the Frankfurt Institute. But amazingly, the many documents survived in Vilna itself, and they were documents and books which the paper brigade hid in the Vilna ghetto and which afterwards were recovered. A few of the members of the paper brigade escaped at the time of the liquidation of the Vilna ghetto in late 1943, and they joined the partisans in the forests, and they, with the Soviet troops, they occupied Vilna. They recovered the books and documents that had survived, and they re-established libraries and archives. But sadly, very soon afterwards, those collections and those re-established institutions fell foul of ideology once again, and they fell foul of the communists who decided that these Jewish institutions were anti-Soviet, and the books and documents were sent once again to the paper mills. But this time, we have another individual who is called Antanas Ulpis, a Lithuanian librarian who rescued the books from the paper mills and hid them in an outpost of the National Library of Lithuania, a secret he kept to the grave, and which he passed on just to a few trusted colleagues who revealed their survival only after the Berlin Wall and communism fell in 1989. Again, in August 1992, just very, very recently, another tragic event took place, and that is the destruction of the National Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Sarajevo, targeted by Serb militia with incendiary devices in order to destroy a library that had been built up to reflect the multicultural nature of Bosnian life and Bosnian society. So there were Muslim, there were Christian, and there were Jewish texts in the National Library. But it was targeted by Serb militias during the siege of Sarajevo. And not only that, but firefighters and librarians trying to rescue collections from the burning building were targeted by snipers. And indeed, librarians lost their lives trying to rescue documents from the ravaged buildings, like Ada Buturovic, who we must remember as one of the casualties on August the 25th. So we mark the anniversary this coming week of the destruction of the National Library of Sarajevo and of the death of Ada Buturovic. And what we must remember is that the Serbs wanted to destroy the record of Muslims in that region of the world, and they targeted not only the National Library but many other libraries in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Kosovo, and they destroyed, for example, land registries, as they didn't want any record of Muslims owning property to survive. And so the libraries and archives of Bosnia and Herzegovina and of Kosovo became incredibly important, and indeed they were part of the indictment of Slobodan Milosevic and other war criminals at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. I'd like to kind of begin to conclude my talk by looking at who controls digital knowledge today. And digital knowledge is increasingly in the hands of a few major tech companies, what I call the private superpowers, following that phrase coined by my colleague at Oxford, Timothy Garton-Ash. And it just shows how important the big companies like Flickr and others are, who we all use on a daily basis, millions of us across the globe, as the platforms for our digital interactions. But the those digital platforms are actually incredibly fragile. And you just need to look at the website of the Supreme Court of the United States, which in 2011, a survey of it found that no fewer than 40% of the web links were broken. So, you know, how important is it to make the laws of the land available to the citizens of a country, but the website is a very kind of fragile medium for doing that. And we saw in January this year, when the Capitol building was besieged, just how important digital information was. The Parler, an app, was used by the insurgents to communicate with each other, which the big tech companies took offline very, very quickly. And so you can see just how much power those tech companies have over public knowledge. But fortunately, the Internet Archive and its wonderful Wayback Machine service captured some of the Parler website, so preserved some of that information before it was taken down by the app stores. But also Twitter, of course, banned Donald Trump from being able to use its platform. And, you know, whatever you think about Donald Trump, the fact that he was able to establish his kind of political credibility was very largely due to his use of social media. And so the fact that Twitter banned him showed that just how important the big tech companies have become. And we've also seen that in the way that Facebook collaborated with Cambridge Analytica in targeting political advertising during the 2016 Brexit referendum, during the 2016 presidential elections, and indeed in many other elections across the globe. And just an indication that targeted advertising, which is how these companies have become extremely rich, is no longer just a commercial activity. It's actually a political activity, which the big tech companies are getting increasingly involved in. And so I think it's very, very important that the world of libraries and archives are capturing our digital lives, and it's very difficult to do so. The National Library of New Zealand is one institution that's dipping their toes in the water with their asking New Zealanders to donate their Facebook archive because Facebook aren't preserving their own for themselves. And I'd like to come back to this idea of knowledge and the prediction of the future, because we're seeing this with things like Fitbits and with Apple Watches and devices which record your bibliometric data. I don't know how many of you wear your Fitbit to the gym, or when you go jogging or cycling, and monitor your heart rate and other vital statistics. But if you do that, or with an Apple Watch, you're actually sharing that data with those companies. And indeed, Google now own Fitbit. And so they're able to match your biometric data with your search history. And they're able to sell that data to, for example, your insurance company, who you have health insurance with. And so they're increasingly able to use various data sources, your biometric data. Are you searching on Google for, the symptoms of heart disease, or for breathlessness, or whatever it may be? But they're increasingly able to predict your future health. And this takes us back, I think, somewhat to the ancient world and to the Library of Ashurbanipal and to those texts about the prediction of the future. Is it right that the great tech companies, the private superpowers, have all of this control over public knowledge? Are we as societies willing to give them that power, not just through lack of regulation, but through our own behavior, where we freely share all of this data with them, data which they use to make themselves more and more powerful and richer? And you can see how important it is to preserve this digital information, where independent, what I call activist archivists, like an organization called FactBase, who captured an archive of all of Donald Trump's deleted tweets. This is a screenshot of Factbase that I took in 2018, which just had over 600. By the time Donald Trump finished with Twitter, there were almost 2,000 deleted messages on that archive. And it brings us back, I think, to George Orwell's famous novel, 1984, which I kind of reread in recent years, and really thinking about it from the perspective of libraries and archives and our current predicament with digital information. This idea that the erasure of the past allows lies to become truth, and we see that with false information being circulated online all the time. And I'd like to finish with some of the reasons why we should value and support and fund libraries and archives properly. And of course, perhaps the most obvious function of libraries and archives is education and educating the public. But they're also places where a diversity of knowledge is available. Not just diverse languages, but diverse ideas. And if you go back to political theorists like John Stuart Mill, whose famous text on liberty is one of the kind of foundational texts of modern democracies, you see that he argues that you cannot have a healthy democracy without having your ideas challenged in open debate and discussion. And I think libraries have an absolutely vital role to play in bringing diversity of ideas into society. But libraries and archives are also places where the rights of citizens are documented. Here, this is a snapshot of the Stasi Museum in Berlin with all of these records, which ordinary citizens in 1989 marched into Stasi headquarters to stop Stasi officers from destroying. They wanted the records to be kept because they wanted to know who was spying on them. Libraries are also reference points for facts and truth. They're places where knowledge is preserved so that the truth can be verified, and that false statements can be documented so that elected officials and others in public life can be held to account. And there are also places, finally, where the identity of communities and of society and of individuals can be preserved and celebrated and given access to and given life to. And here you can see an image of members of the Ethiopian and Eritrean communities in Britain coming to use our collections of Ethiopian and Eritrean books and documents. So I'd like to finish at that point and invite any questions that you may have, and I'll stop sharing my screen at this point.
Thanks, Richard. Here we have a question in here. Just wondering, can you give us information about the very different looking figures standing in a semicircle? This relates to one of the first images you had today at the start of the presentation. They say standing in a semicircle to the left-hand side of the 1930s burning of the books in Germany photo. They say, at first I thought they were naked. I'm looking at this on a smaller screen, but I think they are dressed in light-colored, different clothing. So
okay, let me bring the image back up. Sorry, let's. Oh, did I just stop sharing the screen there? Apologies for that. So let's just go back to the start of my talk. So I don't think anyone is naked in this image. What they are doing, they are all, I think it's because it's a black and white image and it's at night, and that some of the scenes are lit by searchlights, by artificial light, as well as from the bonfire of books. And they're in brown shirts. They're literally in brown shirts, which is, I think, just the way that they're lit in the photograph, and it's a black and white image. But what they are students and members of the Nazi Party who are all gathered to chant as the books are thrown onto the fire, and as they're doing so, they're being filmed by Goebbels's propaganda unit, and those films were then shown in subsequent days and weeks across Germany.
Interesting. We just had a comment in earlier from Marianne. She's just saying that it's really fascinating and extremely moving, and reminding us of the power of books as they reflect the culture of a people, which is, you know, very, very poignant as well. So thanks, Marianne, for that. We have another question in here. Just says, those who shout blasphemy in Pakistan seem to be motivated by the idea of defending God against those who would attack his religion, Islam. What exactly was the motivation of those who plundered medieval libraries in England? Was it to protect the image of God, or to make sure the king's view prevailed?
Oh, well, that's a very good question, and it's a very interesting one. I think there are kind of mixed motivations. So there certainly was a kind of religious ideology. So there were individuals who were kind of fired up with the zeal of Protestantism, and for whom the texts of the old faith of Catholicism were anathema, and that they felt should be destroyed. And so books were targeted in that way, and some of that got established as law as Henry moved his own stance from simply wanting to get the Pope to agree to the annulment of his marriage and to kind of provide intellectual arguments for that, which is what he started John Leland to look for in books. But his own view changed, and that view changed because of his own adoption of Protestant ideology. And I think some of that motivation is pragmatic. He saw an opportunity, so it became a kind of political act. And that's when the arguments stopped being purely about divorce, and they started being about the authority of the Pope over religious and other kind of affairs in his kingdom. And that's when he argued that the king, should be head of the church in England. And what he was doing is seeking texts which proved that the longevity of the church in England before the Norman conquest. And so he was seeking books from the Anglo-Saxon period and earlier, which showed in his argumentation that there wasn't the same degree of papal authority as came with the Norman conquest in 1066. And that's what he got Leland also to look for, and that's why Leland was particularly looking for Anglo-Saxon books. And so that sort of, there's a mixture of that kind of ideology and certain amount of iconography. For example, in 1534, the law was changed to make it a criminal act to celebrate the feast of St. Thomas of Becket. And of course, Henry didn't like Thomas of Becket because he defied, monarchical authority. And so, the shrine of Thomas of Becket in Canterbury Cathedral was desecrated and pulled down. And even in the calendars of religious books, of breviaries and books of hours and so on, the feast day of Thomas of Becket was erased in thousands and thousands of books across the country. Literally, he was cancelled in kind of Henry's cancel culture. And then, of course, all of those missals and other religious books were destroyed, and many of them were torn up and sold to pie makers to line pie dishes, and soap sellers to wrap soap in, and bookbinders to line bookbinding.
Yeah, it's amazing when you think about it. Geraldine is just wondering, in light of everything that's happening in Afghanistan at the moment, is there a national library or archive that may be at risk there?
Yes, there is. And in fact, I'm doing some work on this at the moment. I'm going to be writing a piece in one of the newspapers on the state of libraries and archives in Afghanistan. It's not looking good. So the last Taliban regime saw not only the destruction of books, burnings of books, but the closure of libraries, the banning of women in using libraries, employees were stopped being paid, some librarians lost their lives, the National Archives and other archives were less targeted because they weren't seen as containing texts that were damaging to the or threatening of the Taliban regime, but the staff were just not paid. And so after the re-establishment of the civil government in Afghanistan, the archives started to work again. People were employed as archivists. They started to keep records from government and catalogue them. But now I've been in touch with the National Archivist of Afghanistan, who's had to flee the country, and she's in Tehran at the moment. And the situation is very chaotic, but I'm in touch with librarians who are in hiding in Kabul and are terrified.
Absolutely. That's, I think, all our questions just for today. Thank you to Richard for an absolutely fascinating talk and an equally fascinating book that we enjoyed on top of it all. So
thank you very much.
Hopefully we will have you over in Chester Beatty as soon as, and perhaps maybe the friends might take a trip over to you at some point.
Please do. Well. Please do. Come and see us. You'd be very, very welcome.
As soon as we can, we're allowed out of this country.
Absolutely. Well, as soon as I can, I'm going to be over in Dublin. Don't you worry.
Brilliant. And, you're welcome.
Thank you for thank you for reading the book and for inviting me to come and talk to you.